Royal guards are trained to do something that most people would find almost impossible: stand still, remain focused, ignore the crowds around them, and continue their duty even when hundreds of tourists are watching, taking photographs, or trying to get their attention. For children, however, these soldiers can seem almost larger than life. They see the uniforms, the horses, the ceremonies, and the famous guards standing outside some of London's most historic buildings. And sometimes, a child doesn't want anything complicated. They just want a photograph, a salute, or a tiny moment of recognition from the soldier they've been waiting to see. Most of the time, the guards simply continue with their duties. But every once in a while, something unexpected happens. A guard takes one small step closer. A soldier acknowledges a young fan. A mounted guard allows a special photograph. And for the child standing there, that tiny gesture can become a memory. It can be carried for years. These are some of the most heartwarming moments when Royal Guards showed that behind the strict uniforms and military discipline, there is still a very human side. And the first moment began with the young man who simply wanted a photograph. The guard who took one step closer at Horse Guards Parade in London. Visitors regularly gather to see the mounted soldiers of the household cavalry. The horses stand proudly. The soldiers remain focused, and tourists are expected to respect the space around them. In 2023, a 17-year-old young man named Ibrahim visited the area with his caregiver. Mike Van Erp. Ibrahim has Down syndrome. He was excited to see the mounted guard, but he was also nervous. When it came time to take a photograph, Ibrahim and his caregiver stayed at a respectful distance. They weren't trying to interrupt the soldier, they simply wanted a picture. The camera was ready. Ibrahim stood beside Mike, and the mounted trooper remained in position. Then something unexpected happened. The soldier moved closer. Just one small step. He brought the horse slightly nearer, so the photograph could be taken more easily. For a moment, Ibrahim appeared surprised. So did the people around him. They had been careful to respect the guard's position, and nobody expected the soldier to move toward them. But the reason was simple. He was helping them create the photograph. The picture was taken, and almost immediately, the trooper returned to his original position. The entire interaction lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds meant a lot. The video later spread widely online, attracting millions of views, and the moment was praised as an example of empathy from a serving soldier. For Ibrahim, it wasn't just another photograph, it was a memory created by one small gesture from someone he had come to see. And that wasn't the only time a young visitor received an unexpected acknowledgement from a soldier. The little boy who loved the King's Guard. Some children becoming footballers. Some dream of becoming astronauts, and some dream of becoming soldiers. One young boy named Frank became particularly fascinated by the military. He loved uniforms, he loved ceremonies, and he especially loved watching the King's Guard. Eventually, Frank began visiting the soldiers himself. But he didn't simply stand in the crowd. He often dressed in his own miniature military style uniform. He looked like a tiny soldier standing among the tourists, and whenever the real guards passed by, Frank would do something very simple. He would stand straight, raise his hand and salute. The soldiers were under no obligation to stop. In fact, their duty required them to remain focused. So most of the time, they simply continued marching. But occasionally, one of them noticed Frank, a tiny nod, a quick acknowledgement, sometimes even a short greeting. For Frank, those moments were enormous. He wasn't expecting a conversation. He wasn't asking the soldiers to stop their duties. He simply wanted them to know that he respected what they were doing. And when one of the soldiers acknowledged him, Frank's reaction was impossible to miss. His face lit up. He would return the salute proudly. And suddenly, the little boy who had been watching the guards became part of the moment himself. It was a reminder that children often don't need much to feel special. Sometimes all they need is to be noticed. And Frank kept returning, again and again. Each visit brought another chance to see the soldiers he admired. But eventually, one of his encounters became even more memorable. The young fan, who was recognized by cavalry. Frank's fascination with the military continued to grow. He learned about ceremonies. He practiced his salute, and he became familiar with the movements of the soldiers he watched. Then came a moment he probably never expected. Frank was standing along the mall in London when mounted cavalry approached. He was dressed in his military-style outfit, and as the riders came closer, he did what he had practiced so many times before. He stood straight. He raised his hand, and he saluted. The cavalry continued moving. Then something remarkable happened. The riders performed an eyes-left acknowledgement toward him. For someone unfamiliar with military tradition, it might look like a simple movement, but for Frank, it was completely different. He had spent so much time watching soldiers perform ceremonies. Now the ceremony was acknowledging him. His reaction said everything. He looked stunned, then delighted. For a few seconds, the young military fan wasn't just another person watching the cavalry. He had become part of the moment. The footage was later shared widely online, and viewers loved the expression on his face. It was the kind of surprise that can't be rehearsed, and it showed just how powerful a small gesture from a soldier can be to a child who admires them. But Frank wasn't the only young visitor to experience something unforgettable. The tiny soldier years earlier, another little boy had a special encounter with a real guardsman. His name was Marshall Scott, and he was only 4 years old. Marshall had a love for the military. So when he visited the King's Guard, he arrived dressed in a miniature Coldstream Guards uniform. The little red tunic, the white belt, the tiny military hat. Everything was carefully put together. Standing next to a real guardsman, Marshall looked incredibly small, but he didn't seem nervous. Instead, he stood proudly beside the soldier. Then he raised his hand and gave a salute. The contrast was almost perfect. A tiny child dressed as a soldier, standing beside a real member of the regiment. The moment was captured in photographs, creating a memory for Marshall and his family. And there was an especially sweet detail. The visit happened around Marshall's birthday. So the photograph became more than a tourist souvenir. It became a birthday memory, a picture of a little boy standing beside someone he admired for a child. Moments like this can stay meaningful for a very long time, because when you're 4 years old, the people you admire can seem almost like superheroes. And for Marshall, one of those heroes was standing right beside him. When a guard meets a veteran, but not every act of kindness happens with a child, sometimes the person standing on the other side of the barrier has a story of their own. At Horse Guards Parade, an elderly military veteran and her husband were visiting the mounted guards. They stood at a respectful distance. They didn't want to interfere with the soldier's duty. They simply wanted to photograph. The mounted guard noticed them, and instead of leaving them standing far away, he carefully brought the horse closer. The veteran slowly reached out. She touched the horse, and for a brief moment, she stood beside the magnificent animal with a smile on her face. Her husband captured the moment. It was a simple photograph, but there was something meaningful about it. A veteran standing beside a modern ceremonial soldier. 2 generations connected by military tradition. The guard then calmly guided the horse back into position and continued his duty. No speech, no dramatic announcement, just a small gesture of respect, and sometimes that's all a memorable moment needs. The little girl and the King's Guard horse sometimes, however, the most unforgettable moment doesn't even come from the guard. It comes from the horse. During a visit to St. James's Palace, a young girl approached one of the King's Guard horses with her family. The enormous horse towered above her. She looked fascinated. The family carefully stood nearby and prepared for a photograph. Everything seemed normal. Then the horse moved its head toward the girl. The little girl smiled, and suddenly, the horse leaned closer. For a moment, it appeared to give her a gentle kiss. The girl's reaction was priceless. She couldn't stop smiling. The people around her laughed, and what had started as an ordinary photograph suddenly became something completely unexpected. Nobody had planned it. Nobody told the horse to do it. It simply happened. And because the camera was recording at exactly the right moment, the family captured a memory they could keep forever. The encounter later
attracted
widespread attention online, and once again, A child visiting the King's Guard walked away with something far more memorable than the photograph they originally came for. Why these moments matter there? Something important about all these encounters. The King's Guard isn't designed to be interactive. Entertainment. These soldiers have serious responsibilities. They are trained to maintain discipline. They must follow orders. They have to remain alert, and they cannot simply abandon their position every time a tourist asks for a photograph. That's why these small moments stand out. A nod can feel special. A salute can feel enormous. One step closer can turn an ordinary photograph into a lifelong memory. And for children especially, being recognized by someone they admire can have a powerful effect. Think about what these young visitors actually remember. But they will remember the soldier who noticed them, the guard who returned their salute, the horse that leaned toward them, the moment they stood beside someone wearing the uniform they had dreamed about. Those are the moments that stay. Behind the uniform, the Royal Guards are famous for their discipline. Their uniforms are precise. Their movements are controlled. Their expressions are serious. And their ceremonies follow traditions that have been maintained for generations. But behind every uniform is a person, someone who understands that a child standing nearby may have been waiting for this moment for months. Someone who knows that a small gesture might mean much more to a young fan than it seems, and sometimes when circumstances allow, that humanity shows, not through a huge dramatic action, but through something incredibly small, a nod, a salute, a step, a smile, or a few seconds of attention. That's what makes these moments so powerful. They don't need to be exaggerated. They don't need a dramatic soundtrack. The moment itself is enough. Final moment for the children who experienced these encounters. The Royal Guards may have looked almost untouchable. Perfect uniforms, perfect posture, perfect discipline. But for just a few seconds, that image changed, a soldier noticed. A young fan, a guard helped create a special photograph. A cavalry unit acknowledged a child who admired them. A little boy stood proudly beside a real guardsman, and a horse unexpectedly created a memory that a young girl would probably never forget. None of these moments lasted very long. Some lasted only a few seconds. But that is exactly what makes them so special, because kindness doesn't always require a grand gesture. Sometimes it only requires someone to notice. And when that someone is a royal guard standing in the middle of one of the world's most famous ceremonies even, the smallest gesture can become unforgettable. Behind the discipline, behind the uniform, and behind the perfectly still expression, there is still a human being, and every once in a while that humanity shows